Good morning. Thank you for joining the Veloz webinar, Batteries, Creating Sustainable Practices from Mine to Wheel and Beyond. I'm Lisa Kilodikis, Manager of Technology and Programs here at Veloz. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe and sane as many of us continue to work from home. Today, we are placing all of your microphones on mute to minimize feedback, and we'll be answering questions after the facilitated Q&A session. We do have a full lineup, so we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but feel free to ask a question using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. I want to note that we are recording this webinar, and we will be posting the recording along with the slides following the webinar at the veloz.org website. I am really looking forward to the discussion this morning on this important topic, as the number of electric cars are increasing, and especially as we see California with a goal of 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2035, it is important that mining and supply chain practices are sustainable for electric car batteries, or electric car battery materials, and that there are processes in place for recycling and reusing the batteries. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to talk a little bit about Veloz and give you some background. Veloz is a public-private partnership with almost 40 member organizations, including automakers, utilities, state and local government, third-party charging providers, transportation network companies, nonprofits, and others. You can see from the logos on this screen that Veloz's membership is broad, diverse, and growing. Veloz aims to inspire Californians to drive electric through its large-scale, statewide awareness campaign called Electric for All. Public forums, webinars, networking, and other programs. Our goal is to continue to engage new entities and organizations. So if you are not a member, we invite you to join us. You can visit the Join Us page on the Veloz website to learn more. Veloz also produces an electric car sales dashboard that we publish on our website. We are excited about a recent partnership with the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board for electric car sales and charging data in California on a quarterly basis. Our sales dashboard includes California and US battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, and fuel cell electric vehicle counts, as well as the number of chargers in the state, the number of hydrogen stations, and the available makes and models. We should be having the Q3 data available soon. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have Jennifer Krill, Executive Director of Earthworks, Ethan Elkine, Director of the Climate Program, Center of Law with the Energy and Environment, UC Berkeley School of Law, Alex Grant, Principal of Jade Cove Partners, Rachel Nealer, Transportation Chief of Staff with the Department of Energy, Claudia Becker, Senior Expert Sustainability with the BMW Group, and Hanjiro Ambrose with the California Air Resources Board. With that, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Krill, Executive Director of Earthworks.
What are we going to need in terms of minerals across the board to fulfill a commitment to zero fossil fuels by 2050? In other words, for an electric vehicle perspective, how do we avoid recreating some of the mistakes with internal combustion engine vehicle technology as we build this renewable energy future? So if we transition to 100% EVs, how much mining do we need? The research showed not quite as much as the mining industry likes to hype, but there are a few minerals that we really need to focus on where there is a current scarcity in mineral supply. And those are highlighted here on the slide: cobalt, lithium, and nickel. These key mineral demands are projected to skyrocket in order to fulfill the EV transition and the renewable energy transition. They'll potentially outstrip known reserves, which in turn can drive many of the adverse impacts that I was speaking about earlier: human rights violations, conflict, and environmental damage. And that brings us to a real focus on batteries. So can we have the next slide? Let's take a close look at what some of the impacts for these minerals are. Indonesia is the world's largest nickel ore producer, where projects like the Weda Bay mine threaten the lands of indigenous peoples. And these projects face tremendous resistance and broad international condemnation. In Papua New Guinea, projects like the Ramu cobalt and nickel mine have produced ocean mine waste dumping. Next slide, please. Cobalt is another major concern. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the largest producer of cobalt, where both industrial and artisanal mining have caused tremendous human rights violations and serious environmental impacts, without offering the basic economic benefits that that communities need and demand when they have mining projects in their vicinity. So the artisanal cobalt sector has received the greatest international scrutiny. It's become a real hotspot because of child labor issues. But in large scale mining in DRC as well, there's a great deal of corruption. And an opportunity to transition has been demanded by local communities. A transition towards less corruption and more accountability for the sector. Next slide, please. And lithium. The greatest lithium deposits in the world are in the salt flats of Chile and Bolivia and Argentina. A lot of these projects have not undergone consultation of affected indigenous communities, and we're very concerned about the impacts of lithium extraction on the rights and for these communities and justice for these communities. Another impact of lithium mining is not just the pollution, but actually lowering the water table for accessing water in the desert region where water is scarce and important. Lithium extraction is increasing and being explored in the United States as well, in Nevada, in California, and also in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So we have three principles or demands or guidance, principles for guidance for the industry. We believe a rapid transition to low carbon energy is essential to avert climate catastrophe and to avert the multiple impacts of fossil fuel extraction. We see global investment in new renewable energy infrastructure is critical. We think it is also important that we avoid these risks that we've created with internal combustion engine technology as we embrace this new transition. This is a real inflection point where we can start a new industry and do things differently and perhaps with fewer impacts. So here's what our platform is. Developers and proponents of renewable energy technology need to boost recycling and minimize toxicity. The battery technologies, which the panelists are going to be talking about later, offer this as an opportunity. It's critical that the renewable energy industry embrace this principle of minimizing toxicity and maximizing recyclability. Second, where new minerals must be sourced, for example, those three critical minerals that I flagged earlier, nickel, lithium, and cobalt, we need to ensure that sourcing is as responsible as possible. Earthworks and the lion's share of civil society that are focused on mining support a program called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. This is the most robust, most stringent standard for best practices for mining. There are a lot of programs out there. Some of them are sponsored by industry. Some of them are about single commodities. We favor a system that allows third-party independent auditing and that covers whatever commodity a company might be needing, and that's why we support IRMA. Third, we need to embrace transportation and energy consumption as though we are in a carbon-constrained world, and that means rethinking the systems that we currently have of transport electricity. When investments are being made, rather than investing in new mines, let's prioritize investments in public transit, in bike transit. Let's promote equity and ensure that we've minimized the harm from the point where transportation is occurring. And I think this is my last slide. There. So thank you very much for listening. I'm excited to hear what the others are who follow me have to say.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Um, so next up, we've got Ethan Elkind with UC Berkeley School of Law. Ethan, you are up next.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, Veloz, for organizing this. And Jennifer, I really appreciated your presentation. I think it underlies the stakes involved when we think about EV battery supply chain sustainability. This is an issue that we tackled in a recent report. And part of why we did this is because we are concerned about sustainability as defined by these human rights and local environmental impacts that come out of mining. We're also concerned about the economic sustainability for the mineral producing countries, making sure there's equitable benefits that flow from the mining. But a part of it also is concern about these attacks that we're seeing on batteries that might undermine public confidence in the sustainability of electric vehicles. And you see, opposition industry funded attacks against batteries and really misconstruing and misleading on the benefits of electric vehicles. We looked at some of the analyses, and if you look at life cycle costs just on greenhouse gas emissions, electric vehicles, depending on the grid supplying, how clean the grid is supplying vehicles, the benefits can be anywhere from 40 to 90% emission savings over the life of the vehicle. And also what you see with a lot of incumbent industry attacks on batteries is ignoring the devastating local impacts of oil and gas production all across the world. So that's an important context, but I don't say that to minimize the concerns and to minimize the opportunity, as Jennifer described it, for really creating the foundation and the framework for a more sustainable future for electric vehicles. So Lisa, if you could go to the next slide. With all that as sort of an opening remark, I just wanted to briefly introduce our center at Berkeley Law. For those of you unfamiliar, it's a Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We are the in-house research center on environmental law and policy solutions at UC Berkeley Law School. I direct our climate program, but we also do work on land use, oceans, and water. So you can see some of our friendly faces on that slide and check out our website for more information. Lisa, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So this is a report that we released in July called Sustainable Drive, Sustainable Supply, Priorities to Improve the Electric Vehicle Battery Supply Chain. This was issued in partnership with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is an international NGO focused on looking at issues like mining and oil and gas exploration and trying to create a more equitable framework for mineral producing and oil and gas producing countries. And the report came out of a stakeholder-driven process where we convened. This is pre-pandemic, and actually Claudia was part of that. Able to come to California in the old times before the pandemic shut everything down. But we convened folks from the industry, auto industry, mining sector, for advocacy sector, public sector, and academic experts. Hanjiro was also part of that discussion as well, and as well as some outreach that we did with stakeholders across the EV supply chain to try to figure out what does sustainability mean? What are some of the key challenges to getting there on the battery supply chain, and what are some of the key solutions? So I've just got a few more slides that really go through the top level findings, and you can dig into the report if you want to get more information. So Lisa, if you go to the next slide, this shows our effort to just visualize and create an image here of what the supply chain looks like. A lot of people are not really familiar with what the EV battery supply chain looks like. So first at the top, you can see some of the key minerals. Jennifer went through some of these, but cobalt, lithium, and then other minerals as we describe it, which would be nickel and copper, some of the other things that go into the batteries. And of course, this is changing too. We know the industry, for example, is really phasing out cobalt. But for now, this is the picture here. So you can see we're starting with the mines that go to traders and then go to refiners. And then they go down to this middle blue line here. And what we want to emphasize with this slide is a couple things. So first of all, just how multi-layered the supply chain is. This is not just automakers, controlling the entire battery supply chain. These are multiple players involved, many of which are not public facing at all. And furthermore, as you look at that blue line there of those three boxes, they're heavily concentrated in Asia, East Asia, and China in particular. So we've got a supply chain bottleneck. So not only is it multi-layered, with multiple steps along the way, but you've also got this bottleneck in China and to some extent in Japan and Korea as well. So you go to the cathode manufacturer, cell manufacturer, and then the pack manufacturer. That then goes to the vehicle manufacturer to install the battery, and then it goes to the consumer. And if all goes well, when the batteries are no longer of good use within the vehicle itself, it go to be repurposed or recycled. So I just hope that that information, this visual, is helpful for folks. Next slide. So when we think about sustainability, we think about what are some of the challenges to actually achieving what we would like to see in an ideal state. And so we surface three key challenges or barriers to sustainability. So first is a lack of coordinated action, accountability, and access to information across the supply chain. So you could see from that previous slide just how varied the supply chain is. And so getting coordinated action among all those players, as well as getting accountability and access to all the information within those different players, is a challenge for stakeholders and for folks within that supply chain as well. So even for the automakers to have a sense, as they're the public facing ones that get the brunt of any public criticisms, how do they influence all these different stages of actors across the supply chain? Secondly, inadequate coordination and data sharing across the multiple supply chain standards limits adherence. So one thing that we heard about was that we don't need a new standard, but we've got plenty of standards. And Jennifer mentioned IRMA. There's also the OECD guidance on responsible mining. So there's a lot of different standards out there, but the data sharing to understand if there's adherence to these standards and the lack of coordination among all these players really creates a challenge. And then finally, key barrier, just pointing out the regulatory and logistical barriers that inhibit battery life extension, reuse, and recycling. There's a lot of all sorts of random, in some cases, at least from my perspective, somewhat random regulatory challenges, hazardous waste regulations governing the transport of batteries, for example, let alone the permitting challenges around siting all the different recycling centers we'd have to set up around the globe to try to harness and recycle and repurpose the millions of electric vehicle batteries that we foresee driving along the roads. So next slide, please. So just to summarize here some of the key responses that we talk about in our report. So first, we need to improve data transparency and promote neutral and reliable information sharing. If we don't have accurate data and accessible, transparent data, we're not going to be able to ensure adherence to the standards that are in place and understanding where there are problems. Secondly, we need to map the existing standards we have through a taxonomy of criteria to show where they overlap, to show who they apply to. And I'll show an example of this taxonomy in the next slide in a second, but don't go to that, Lisa. Let's stay on this one. So thirdly, we need to create new incentives to adhere to existing standards and initiatives. So for example, potentially a labeling and certification effort where consumers, if it's fleet purchasers or jurisdictions like California that want to ensure the batteries in the vehicles meet certain standards, maybe we need a labeling or certification type process to really give an extra incentive for all the different supply chain actors to adhere to these standards. And finally, we need to make sure we design batteries proactively for recycling and reuse and collaborate and think in advance on how we plan out infrastructure for regional recycling and repurposing as well of the batteries. So next slide, please. So this is an example of the taxonomy. When we talk about all the different standards out there, we essentially need a map of these standards so that people have some clarity on what applies to what. And this is an example of the type of sort of spreadsheet that we could put together to help folks understand how the different standards interrelate, looking at who they affect, what their enforcement mechanisms are, what content they govern, what the implementation mechanisms are. You can see just as an example here. So for the next slide, please. So this is last slide, and I'll just say if you want to look at and get more detail out of this and look at our report, Sustainable Drive, Sustainable Supply, you can go to our website, clee.berkeley.edu, and my email address is there as well if anyone wants to follow up. And of course, we've got Q&A coming up, so I'm happy to answer questions on this webinar. But with that, I'll leave it to Lisa to hand over to the other participants. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan. That was a lot of great information. So interesting. A lot of challenges to address. So the next speaker I'm looking forward to hearing from is Alex Grant with Jade Cove Partners. So Alex, I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with the kind of California EV sphere, since I spend most of my time in kind of the mining and chemical processing industry proper. Though I am based in San Francisco, actually. Just like kind of a 15-second rundown of me, I'm originally from Toronto, studied chemical engineering and philosophy in undergrad, went for a PhD in chemical engineering to study CO2 conversion and solar fuels. Realized that there were some entropy issues with that scheme. Left with a master's and co-founded a technology company called Lilac Solutions, which is a lithium extraction technology company. And about a year and a half ago, I left and became independent and started my own company called Jade Cove Partners, where I am consulting across the lithium industry, focused on technology development and deployment, environmental impact quantification and mitigation, and natural resource development. Yeah, I'm really excited to share our perspectives with respect to how we are doing life cycle assessment on lithium mining. So this is the step of the value chain from nature to battery chemical. I just want to make 2 points before I kind of dive in. First of all, you cannot recycle your way to high EV penetration. There simply are not enough metal ions kind of in the technosphere already for that to be possible, whether that's lithium, nickel, cobalt, or otherwise. It is a very kind of straightforward mass balance that will that makes it clear that doesn't work. So, does recycling have a huge role to play in reducing the environmental impacts of battery manufacturing in the future? 100%, and every single industry analyst acknowledges that and embraces that. But we have a lot of mining to do before we get to that point, and we have to figure out what the good mining looks like, right? So, Jennifer and Ethan gave some really good presentations there, and Jennifer spoke about the need to kind of stop mines in places where there shouldn't be mines, which is critical work, that must happen. However, we need to identify what are the places where mines should be built, right? Like we need to understand like what is kind of the positive side of that coin, because there is a positive side of that coin. Responsible and kind of low environmental impact extraction is possible, and we're developing the tools for how to do that. So that's one point, and then a second point is that the majority of the CO2 emissions of the lifetime of an electric vehicle is in its manufacturing. Notably, if you have a clean grid, for example, like in Ontario or an upper New York State or a southern Nevada, 20 to 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour kind of grid. If you're on a Germany grid or a Polish grid or an Alberta grid, where you're still in the 600 to 800 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour range, then a huge fraction of the emissions of the electric vehicle will be in the use phase. But we know how to decarbonize power. That's a pretty straightforward operation at this point. But what we don't know how to do as well is how to decarbonize mineral extraction and processing. And that's what I spend my time working on. So Lisa, by the way, how much time do I have?
Yeah, I not a lot more time.
I'm gonna blitz. Don't worry.
So I know you have a lot of slides. So
I know. I'm the worst.
Your perspective. So
how do I go next?
I'll do your slides for you. So
okay, next slide.
Tell me when.
So these are the red skies above San Francisco, my city, on September 9th. Climate change is real, and we need to take it very seriously. Next slide. This is a quote that I heard from J.B. Straubel a couple weeks ago that I'm just going to read out, and then I'm going to blitz through my presentation from here. And I really just want to cultivate an appreciation for the importance of what is contained in this quote. The embodied emissions of the materials you use to make batteries are significant and need to be understood. If you were to power all your EV manufacturing using coal, it would make no difference at the end of the day. One thing we did when we built the Gigafactory was to make it all electric. There is literally no natural gas line, so there is little to no local emissions at that factory. When you have natural gas through your facility, it makes it much harder to chase it out. The emissions all the way back up to the mine are significant. And when you look at terawatt-hour scales of production, we need to make sure we are not creating unintended consequences as we go through this industrial shift. That is why we are in this situation in the first place, and we need to rapidly remediate that. Next slide. So I'll mostly just talk about this slide. So with a group of very talented engineers based in London and California, called Minviro, we do industrial life cycle assessment of battery chemical manufacturing from natural resources, whether it's lithium hydroxide, nickel, manganese, cobalt, graphite, etc. We've looked at them all, and one huge takeaway that we've kind of identified and we share with the world is that there's no such thing as a CO2 intensity of making lithium or nickel or any particular battery chemical. There are many. There's a huge range, and it depends very heavily on the type of resource, its grade, its impurities, and the final product, and everything that's done in between. And everything that's done in between is hydrometallurgy. It's mining. It's grinding. It's particle processing. Like it's really technical, really nitty-gritty stuff. And if you really want to understand and control the environmental impacts of batteries, you have to understand that nitty-gritty, deep technical stuff. So just a fun little number. We calculated that at 3 terawatt-hour per year of production, which is what Tesla wants to do in 2030, by choosing low CO2 intense chemicals versus high CO2 intense chemicals, they could avoid the 2019 emissions of all of Switzerland, Portugal, and Ireland. So that is absolutely huge. 10 people in California right now have that power. It's very significant. Next slide. Next slide. I'll kind of try to go faster here. So like technical problem requires technical solutions. And that's what we spent a lot of time thinking about, is what are those technical solutions? How do we shift energy input in a manufacturing process from heat, which is challenging to decarbonize, to electricity, which is much more straightforward to decarbonize. Next. Electric mining exists. Next slide. So just to kind of reiterate slide 1 there, let this be your canary in the coal mine, battery and EV industry. Right now we're burning coal to make battery chemicals. Tesla is buying lithium hydroxide that has 2 tons of coal burned per ton of lithium hydroxide monohydrate. That should stop. It is significant, and that is the majority of the environmental impact of manufacturing cathode material, for example, today. Next slide. Next slide. There are many different stakeholders and kind of participants in the lithium extraction and processing industry, and they all have different role to play. Engineers have an important role to play when it comes to developing new technologies that obviate the need for incorporating the old energy system into the new energy system. Investors have a role to play in terms of helping make sure that polluting projects are not built in the first place. And battery chemical buyers have a very important role to play, which is to always demand life cycle assessments for new projects, and to not give offtake agreements to projects that have too high of a CO2 intensity or water use or whatever it may be. Ultimately, that's how kind of behavior will be guided. Next slide. So that's it for me. So again, my 2 main points that I hope you'll remember is that most of the environmental impact is in manufacturing the battery, and that is a kind of mineral and chemical engineering problem, and recycling is absolutely a critical and important operation in this new energy system. However, we first need to really identify how we're going to get those lithium atoms out of nature first before we can recycle them. So there's a heck of a lot of work to do on that front. And if anyone ever wants to talk about that with me, you've got my email, you've got my Twitter. Feel free to reach out.
Wow, thanks, Alex. I am impressed with the way you sped through your slides and all the great information and messages and in there. So I really appreciate that. So next we have Rachel Mueller, Transportation Chief of Staff with the Department of Energy. So welcome, Rachel, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you, but I can't see you yet. But
oh,
I can hear you.
Okay, it looks to be like it's on. So hopefully, in the effort to keep things moving forward, I'll start going through things.
I'm not sure.
But
Is your camera blocked with anything, or is it open? Okay.
Let me stop and start one more time.
Okay. Well, we can just get started.
Yep. Sorry, it looks
Yeah,
like it
no
might
problem.
be frozen.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right. Thank you all for joining today, and thank you, Lisa and Veloz, for pulling together this interesting webinar. So I'm Rachel Nealer. I'm the Transportation Chief of Staff, and I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of battery research and development at the Department of Energy. I will note that as Transportation Chief of Staff, this is going to be a little bit skewed to the transportation side, but I will note that many of our offices are working on energy storage because it is of particular interest these days. But I'm going to attempt to include as many of those cross-cut efforts as possible. So the Vehicle Technologies Office, for example, has been researching and developing batteries for decades. Just in this past year, in FY20, our overall budget was just under $400 million, and about $175 million of that went to batteries. So it is a big investment for us, specifically in the Vehicle Technologies Office, but also across DOE. So we have kind of our main cost goals to drive down the costs of electric vehicle batteries so that they are very competitive in the marketplace. We've seen about an 80% drop over the past 10 years. Just about a couple of years ago, the battery costs were at about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Now we're around $200 per kilowatt hour, maybe a little bit less, but our goal really is to reduce it even further to $150 per kilowatt hour, and with a long-term goal of $80 per kilowatt hour, which is really what we see as cost parity at the point of purchase. And you know, that's kind of one of our overarching goals in the Vehicle Technologies Office, so that we are getting electric vehicles on the road. But now we have about 1.6 million vehicles on the road across the US, and we're starting to broaden our scope a little bit more. You know, the cost goals are going to remain consistent until we really drive down them. But we're looking at batteries in a more holistic way, and that manifests itself in a couple of different ways, focusing on the battery end of life as well as the battery supply chain and critical materials. So we have, you can see this kind of strategy that targets those different areas, developing low and no cobalt cathodes, the lithium battery recycling R&D, which is happening a lot through the US ABC collaboration with DOE, and our Resell Center at Argonne National Lab, which was launched in 2019, as well as the Lithium Ion Battery Recycling Prize, also launched in 2019. The Resell Center aims to grow sustainable advanced battery recycling industry by developing economic and environmentally sound recycling processes that can be adopted by industry for lithium ion and future battery chemistries. I'll talk about the Lithium Ion Battery Recycling Prize in a minute. But just to note that we've had a couple different recent announcements. In August 2020, DOE announced selection of 16 projects through our battery manufacturing lab call, which is a combined funding of almost $15 million over 3 years. So I apologize for this data dump. It's just going to be a big data dump because I'm trying to cover hundreds of millions of dollars of research and development here. But then we also have the Advanced Manufacturing Office, which is a sister office to the Vehicle Technologies Office that runs the Critical Materials Institute, but in collaboration with Ames Laboratory, that seeks to eliminate and reduce reliance on rare earth metals and other materials subject to supply chain disruptions. And in October 2020, they announced a $4 million effort that focuses on 3 areas: conversion of raw material feedstock into high-value products, novel separations from end-of-life batteries, and unconventional domestic supplies of cobalt. So if we're really broadening our perspective here, because with 1.6 million vehicles on the road, we've got to figure out what we're going to do with the end of those batteries, but also think about the supply chain and how we're going to scale it up and potentially use fewer critical materials. So next slide, please. So specific to the vehicle technologies, so we have two particular initiatives that kind of highlight some of our battery strategy. So there's the Energy Storage Grand Challenge. We just released a roadmap. You can see the a little bit unfriendly link at the bottom there if you want some more information. And you can see that the different kind of cross-cutting tracks and use cases that the Energy Storage Grand Challenge focuses on. But it's really a comprehensive program to accelerate the development, commercialization, and utilization of next-generation energy storage technologies and sustain American global leadership in energy storage. So it's a little bit broader than electric vehicle batteries, but you can see in the use case that it does touch on the electrified mobility. On the right, we have the Battery Recycling Prize, and that is kind of an innovative way for us to partner with industry and integrate various components of battery recycling challenges to offer an end-to-end strategy. So we're in the second phase of that right now. The first phase winners, there were 15 of them, and they covered projects in collection, separation and sorting, reverse logistics, safe storage and transport, and a couple of unique that are slightly outside of those scopes. But these are really just two examples that are occurring at DOE on batteries, but we also have regular funding opportunities for our national labs and our other stakeholders by office each year. So if you could go to the next one. That kind of comes in two different categories, I would say. One is a more specific funding opportunity, which is the second half of the slide, but we're also kind of gathering critical information to drive our R&D strategy. So we have a couple of requests for information that we put out, one recently on the battery critical material supply chain R&D. Those comments were due at the end of July. And then the Energy Storage Grand Challenge roadmap, the R&D roadmap that we developed, we really want to get industry and other stakeholder feedback so that when we invest in the R&D, we have a path for it to be taken up by the market. And then lastly, just recently announced in July, we had a couple of selections through the Vehicle Technologies Office on advanced lithium-ion batteries, reducing the need for critical minerals in our electric motors. And then just to show you a little bit more about how comprehensively we're thinking about this electric vehicle scale up is even accelerating the development of smart charging technologies to mitigate potential EV impacts on the grid. You could also tie that to the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, where we're looking at also ways that we can support the grid with some of our energy storage technologies. So we've got a lot going on at the DOE these days, and batteries and energy storage, especially increasing the scope to the full life cycle, is of great interest to us right now. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to questions and the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Yeah, you're doing a lot there at DOE, so we appreciate that hard work. So now we are going to welcome Claudia Becker with the BMW Group. And thanks, Claudia, for spending some time in your evening with us. And I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Lisa. And yeah, thanks for the invitation. And I'm actually happy to provide some background also directly from a vehicle producer, and show some examples of our sustainability strategy for batteries, focusing on cobalt on the next slides. So if we start with the first slide, I would like to start with providing you an overview of our BMW sustainability strategy, but with providing some really concrete examples on our batteries. So first, if we're looking at environmental and social compliance, BMW claims to have the most sustainable supply chain in the industry, and I will show concrete examples for cobalt and lithium on the next 2 slides. The second pillar, CO2 emissions over life cycle, is also especially important if we're looking at batteries, because battery production, as we already heard, is very energy intense. So due to the electrification of our fleet, CO2 emissions per vehicle would increase by 1/3 by 2030 for us. But instead, the BMW Group has set itself the goal to actually reduce the amount of CO2 produced per vehicle by 2030 by 20%. So that's a reduction of more than 50% that we are trying to achieve here. And just to provide some examples of measures, we agreed with our cell suppliers already to just use green power as of this year for the production of the battery cells. And furthermore, we already introduced CO2 as a decision criterion in the tender process for very energy intense components, and we'll roll this out to each and every part that we're purchasing, so that this becomes actually, the CO2 footprint becomes a decision criterion besides price, quality, engineering. And then the third pillar, if we're looking at circularity, of course, we're also trying to increase the use of recycled materials for our components, especially also for the batteries, where this is possible without any quality deficits. But we also do design our batteries for recycling so that the raw materials can be extracted after their lifetime. And let me say, we not only plan to have the vehicles in the car for up to 8 to 10 years, but also have provisioned a second life strategy for our batteries to use them in energy storages. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at now our concrete program that we assigned for cobalt, let me just give you 4 examples here on this slide. Actually, we always start with our standard due diligence process that follows the OECD due diligence guidance, where we started to work with our cell suppliers for the batteries. And together with them and the underlying tier levels, we did map our cobalt supply chain. And if you remember Ethan's slide before of the battery supply chain, trust me, it looks much more complicated. For one battery, there are more than 100 players in the chain. It's not just one cathode manufacturer, it's not just one refiner. And one refiner usually has more sources than just 2 mines, for example. So for cobalt, we did publish the list of smelters, refiners, and countries of origin on our website. But as we sometimes were doubting the information, we actually decided to go 1 step further, and that's the second pillar. So really starting as of the so-called 5th generation of our battery cells that go into production this year, we do directly purchase cobalt and lithium. So cobalt is coming from mines in Morocco and Australia, and lithium from mines in Australia. So we do provide those raw materials directly to our supply chain partners. And this allows us, on the one hand, to secure the amount of raw materials that we need for the further electrification of our fleet. But as we are a rather small producer in comparison to others, the main reason really was that we want to be able to fully control the material origin and thus also the sustainability of cobalt and lithium. Third pillar, I would just like to give some examples on the various initiatives that we as BMW Group are joining in order to increase transparency. So starting with Drive Sustainability, which are 11 automakers that join to enhance sustainability in the automotive supply chain, where we have the aim also to address tier 2 and sub-suppliers, for example, with specific regional trainings that we're also conducting, for example, in China, where a lot of production of batteries and raw materials take place. The Responsible Mineral Initiative developed a cobalt refiner audit standard that is very relevant, of course, for our smelters in our supply chain. And together with the Global Battery Alliance is leading the Cobalt Action Partnership that is currently working towards the definition of a standard for artisanal cobalt mining. And I'm glad that Jennifer already mentioned IRMA. We also joined the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance as of this year in order to also address the mining level, and therefore selected IRMA as it really provides the most high bar standard, most comprehensive standard if you're looking at social and environmental topics that are addressed by IRMA, plus also the multi-stakeholder engagement in the standard development. So not just industry peers that joined to define what sustainability for mined minerals looks like, but also taking into consideration voices by NGOs and even mining affected communities. So to come to the last pillar, we also do engage locally in the DR Congo to answer the question, can artisanally mined cobalt be responsible in the end? And therefore, please, the last slide. We have been in the DRC twice now, first before starting off this project, to really experience that artisanal mining actually is an important economic factor in the DR Congo, as it provides incomes for roughly 1 million people. So we decided that we want to launch this project together with partners from our supply chain, Samsung SDI as one of our cell producers, BASF as cathode producer, and selected GIZ as implementing partner together with further NGOs to conduct our two components of the project. And really the aim is, can we formalize artisanal mining really to such a level that it would fulfill our BMW Group sustainability requirements, really to pilot if we can qualify artisanally mined cobalt actually for our value chain and add this as a third source for direct sourcing for our batteries. So just a short outlook on the two components and some examples of concrete activities. We just started trainings for 12 artisanal mining cooperatives that reach about 1,500 miners. We do implement occupational health and safety standards that, for example, address PPE use or tunnel construction, or also environmental measures, for example, dust prevention, just to name one. But of course, we're also working with the community in order to really fight the underlying root cause of child labor. And this week, we just inaugurated a school in Kisote that offers free and quality education. But we also just had the first harvest as part of our diversification of household part of the program, where we especially trained women in agricultural techniques, but also financial literacy training, saving groups, and so on. And let me say, this project for us is actually successful if we not just work on one side, but if we can scale it up to further sites and really increase the impact in the copper belt, join our forces together with the Responsible Mineral Initiative, with the Global Battery Alliance. So to really take those lessons learned from the standard, pilot the standard that's going to be developed, and really see if this is a feasible model for the automotive industry. So with this, I would like to stop and looking for your questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I mean, it's amazing to hear what BMW is doing to make this battery process and mining and the whole system more sustainable. It's really great to hear. So now we are going to turn it over to Hanjiro Ambros with the Air Resources Board to wrap up our presentation. So I will turn it over to you, Hanjiro.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you to the rest of my colleagues and panelists. You know, sort of unenviable. You guys have covered a lot of really important ground. I guess at bat and cleanup, I will try to kind of play off some of the things that I heard as I've been busily taking notes, listening to all your excellent presentations. And I think, thank you, Jennifer, for, you know, just bringing up the human dimension and the potential equity impacts of the supply chain, you know, mentioning, I think, building this foundation for sustainable EVs. And Ethan, you know, I think really highlighting the concern that that batteries are being, you know, sort of used as an attack point, as a place to attack the sustainability of vehicle electrification. And that is an important piece that research, I think there's a role for research to address those concerns. Alex, and I think I like to hear this. One thing I took away from you is we have a lot of mining to do before we get to a recycled future. And I think that's really important to remember, that we do have to identify where we want to develop responsibly deposits of important critical minerals. And thank you for acknowledging, obviously, that this is a spectrum, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of variability, and there's a lot of uncertainty, both in estimating the environmental impacts, in particular even GHGs, from some of these materials. And so it's important for us to realize that, because that's an opportunity for us to select preferable, or to make preferable choices, right? We know that there's some variability, which means there's a place in there to select something good. There's a good part of that marginal dispatch curve for us to target. And obviously exciting to hear about all the work at DOE to help integrate the landscape of EVs, energy storage, and also the exciting work at BMW. I hear often we talk about the challenges for automotive manufacturers, in that they have these supply chains where there's several tiers, right? Several to dozens of tiers of different suppliers. And that's a barrier, obviously, but it's also an opportunity, because you have this ecosystem of competitive bids, which really gives you an opportunity to leverage your own sustainability goals and maximize their impact by leveraging suppliers and against one another. I heard a lot of talk about the GHG footprint of batteries with respect to the contribution to EVs, and a few panels discussed that. I think it's always important to remember that currently EV batteries do have a relatively significant contribution potentially to the footprint of an electric vehicle. But that doesn't discount from the fact that when we compare those footprints to the gasoline alternatives that we're replacing, it's still significant reductions, and that as we electrify and we decarbonize the grid, that we compound those reductions over time. So you buy your gasoline vehicle today, the carbon intensity of every mile you drive is only going to increase, given that there's a limited number of biofuels in the light duty vehicle stock. But your EV is actually getting cleaner as you drive it, because the grid is getting cleaner. So that's something important to remember. So just turning on here, I want to talk about kind of bringing home a few themes on thinking about closing the loop here, on really thinking about how do we increase circularity in the EV supply chain, and what is the role of policy in driving kind of a more sustainable future. We heard one role of policy from the Department of Energy, which is obviously supporting basic science and innovative research on new technology development. But there's also an important role for policy to play in ensuring sustainable practices. And I heard a few bins or buckets of things, the different strategies brought up, particularly by Ethan. And so, I'll talk about a couple of those today. This information sharing piece, the economics, the material recovery, and also maybe the equity. So let's move on to the next slide. So, one thing I just like to acknowledge the fact that, and Claudia brought it up, is that, batteries, because of the way batteries degrade during their vehicle cycle, there's going to be likely a significant amount of stored energy capacity that is rendered inaccessible to high power outputs. Basically, EVs are high power devices generally, and so the batteries, the degradation of the battery on the capacity is only part of the story. That as batteries degrade, they undergo multiple processes that include both this loss of capacity as well as power fade, and power fade is a significant reason why batteries tend to move out potentially of the EV market. The other thing here to remember is that vehicles are going to get retired for a range of reasons, just as they do today. That there's a lot of reasons why vehicles come off the road. So the policy plays an important role in enabling us to derive the residual value of the unutilized battery asset. We have these batteries, we're going to deploy them in EVs. Whether we take them out of the EV at the end of the life, or whether we use them more during the life, we need to think about how we can pass that value through. And allow that to decrease the upfront cost of EV adoption. And that's one important policy strategy, right? Is to drive down the cost of EVs by making sure that we make them as economical as possible. That's one way we could do that. And there's two strategies to do that. You hear a lot of people talk about second life, where we might, and then Claudia mentioned, take the batteries out of the vehicles after they've been through a certain amount of time in a vehicle. Or, another similar strategy I view as a connected strategy is vehicle to grid integration with bidirectional or managed charging. And really, I think these take advantage of the same thing. The fact that some of that battery storage is not going to be utilized during the vehicle life. Vehicles spend 99% of their time sitting around unoccupied and unused. And batteries, like I said, are going to last a long time. So that's just one area of policy. Next slide, please.
Oop.
I can go the other direction.
No, that went the wrong way. There we go.
Cool. Now, Alex acknowledged the fact that it's going to be a while till we can really make a significant dent into material demand from recycled materials. And that's because, EVs haven't been around that long. We started selling EVs in about 2012, and the ramp has been very slow on lithium EVs. And so there's going to be a while until we reach, a market mass. But that being said, regionally, there are opportunities to start to close the loop. And by about 2040, there's going to be a significant number of EVs coming off the road, such that we could start, if we could close the loop very efficiently, 100% efficiency. So these numbers are kind of that I'm showing on the slide right now are optimistic. But given some optimistic assumptions for collection and material recovery, it's possible that recycled batteries are going to start to represent a significant potential source of critical minerals for battery cells and cathodes. And that's important because of all the impacts that were and concerns, I think, that were raised by some of my colleagues and previous presenters. Recycled materials offer a potentially, regionally localized, in the market and near to market source of materials, that could avoid some of the sustainability and environmental impacts that raw materials encounter. In addition to the real point here, I think, is avoiding additional exploration and development of deposits which are high intensity to develop. Deposits which require a lot of are difficult to access, or are of lower grade or higher contaminant, where it requires more energy and more inputs to get them. So recycled materials are going to be a key source for that. And it's not just about the environmental comparison of the intensity of a kilogram of recycled cobalt versus a kilogram of virgin cobalt, because, as we said, there's a lot of impacts along the supply chain which aren't well quantified by any particular environmental metric. Next slide, please. So, the U.S. is in a bit of a vacuum with respect to policy for governing these types of devices, and we have a patchwork of hazardous waste designations which currently govern batteries. And so, batteries, whether once they're done, once the vehicle's been disposed or they're taken out of the vehicle, are considered technically a waste. And so there's regulations in place that restrict their handling and their transportation. And internationally, there has been some recent developments in the last year or two, in particular, on creating some new policies to manage electric vehicle battery waste. And I think these offer some opportunities for learning and definitely some examples for policy development in the U.S., both good and bad. In particular, I think you see this different types of policy mechanisms here in this table. In the battery directive, which is the 15-year-old now, or almost 15-year-old European Union policy covering batteries, requires some of the things that we talked about today, like a labeling and disposal requirement and a recycling rate. But I think that we might want to look towards policies which would be more forward-looking policies as far as driving up the content of recycled material in batteries. And so, environmental product rules like the EPR column here, I think are one strategy, but for trying to develop some of these metrics. But in particular, one thing I've just been encouraging folks is to think about, instead of talking about collection or recycling, talk about recycled content. Because I think it will help us think more forward about what the goal is, and that the goal is to identify sustainable sources of critical minerals, not just to ensure that recycling occurs. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. So, you know, from a policy perspective, there are examples out there, obviously, of systems which we've developed to manage the end of life of other technologies. Good examples, bad examples. I think that's an open question. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, though. So I think one thing we shouldn't ignore is that we do have examples out there that we can look to and think about, like lead acid battery recycling. You know, in the U.S., we do have a relatively robust system of lead acid battery collection and recycling. Really high production of secondary, or really high role of secondary lead in lead acid battery in the U.S. But also, you know, a legacy and issues with the direct environmental impacts and impacts on communities around lead acid battery recycling facilities. And so I think this gives us that example of policy systems can be designed to be effective at certain metrics, but can fall short on their health protectiveness and their ability to really ensure a sustainable and responsible supply chain. So I think you know, we should think about these kind of complications, and just as like I said, as we look forward and develop new policies, just being sure that we're aware of some of the shortfalls that have happened before, and ensure that equity and environmental justice, and particularly these kind of community impacts, are placed front and center in our evaluation criteria. Next slide. Just to highlight, you know, one thing too, just that battery designs are changing. You know, we talked about just the shifts in cathode chemistries towards the low cobalt chemistries, you know, away from sort of the, you know, equal part cobalt nickelate formulations to the high nickel, low cobalt formulations that are being kind of pushed, you know, by a lot of the manufacturers now. You hear about, you know, 523 and 622 and 811 formulations of nickel, cobalt, and aluminum ratios in the cathode. But at a higher level, and this is a really silly slide, but at a higher level, I just want to highlight the fact that lithium-ion batteries are a relatively new kid on the block. You know, these batteries were, you know, lithium cobalt oxide cells were patented in the early 90s, and these batteries continue to evolve. There's a lot of intellectual property, a lot of IP in the pipeline with respect to improving battery cells, improving battery cathodes, improving battery anodes in particular, removing the electrolyte, improving the separator. There's a lot of stuff that's happening, and that's a moving target for recycling. It's a moving target for battery design. And so I think we do have to acknowledge that when we talk about trying to, you know, maybe encourage standardization or design for recyclability, or other types of strategies. You know, like I said, we want to make sure that we don't, you know, stifle potential innovations here, and realize the fact that things are going to continue to evolve, and that there's still a lot of opportunity for improvement in lithium-ion batteries. Final slide, I think. Maybe I had one more. Oh, okay. Yeah, just, you know, another thing with the regional supply piece that I think we should consider is that, you know, we do have examples of global value chains for electronic wastes, and well-established value chains for downcycling of electronic wastes to markets that have lower environmental standards for recycling and for end-of-life processing. I think this is, I show this slide generally just to sort of say that we need to kind of switch from NIMBY to YIMBY. You know, you hear this acronym, not in my backyard. And I think with battery recycling and battery infrastructure, EV infrastructure, you know, we need to say yes in my backyard. And how do we develop sustainable and environmentally responsible manufacturing and industrial facilities that can coexist safely near communities, and process these EVs and make EVs from them I think that sounds, sometimes that sounds like a pipe dream, but I think it's actually doable. I have a lot of faith in talented engineers like Mr. Grant over there. So I think that's my last slide. I do wear a few hats. I work with a really great group of folks at UC Davis, a few of them listed here. We've been supporting the California Recycling Resource and Recycling Group in their efforts to develop policy recommendations for the legislature under Assembly Bill 2832 and the lithium ion battery recycling group. I also am recently a fellow for the Union of Concerned Scientists and have some reports that are coming out from them, as well as some blogs if you're interested, and as well as some more traditional journal publications. And like I said, feel free to reach out. Either any email you find me. My first name is pretty distinctive, so if you do Google me, I'm actually on the first page usually on my first name. So there you go. That's about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Hanjiro, and thank you to all of our presenters, all the great information. Really appreciate it. Now we're going to dive into some questions, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the participants. So keep those questions coming. We'll get to as many as we can, but we may not have a lot of time for that, but we'll try to do our best here. So I just want to kick off some questions with our panelists. So Ethan, I'm going to start with you. So will creating sustainable supply chain for battery materials used in electric car batteries significantly increase the cost of electric cars for the consumer?
I think there's actually the opposite risk, that if we don't have a sustainable supply chain, we may run into some real market issues with electric vehicles. But first of all, there's a consumer facing risk here that if people start hearing a lot of these stories, as I was mentioning at the beginning, that are often funded by legacy incumbents that are concerned about the threat that EVs pose to their profits, that could take hold and potentially undermine some of the confidence in the sustainability of EVs and depress the market. So that's one risk on the consumer side if we don't get a handle on this. And then on the supplier side, there's the risk of instability. I mean, we've seen this on the oil and gas side with OPEC embargoes, for example, that have dramatically spiked prices for gasoline. I think we could see the same thing if we don't have a broad-based, more sustainable supply chain. And a lot of that hinges on the health of the mineral producing countries themselves and how healthy their governance systems are. So one of the research projects that we're engaging in as a follow-up to the report that I mentioned is figuring out what are some of the reforms we need to see in these key mineral producing countries that would ensure better governance so that you see the sustainability on all fronts, economic and environmental, human rights, et cetera. And then what are the actions that the international EV stakeholders can take to support those in-country reforms? So I think unless we get a handle on this, we're going to actually see the opposite problem. And I think we should not be concerned about adding additional costs to the EVs themselves, but the opposite.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. So Claudia, the next question's for you. So what is BMW doing regarding after the battery is used in the car, like a second use for the batteries?
Yeah, I've been shortly talking on this, but can I add also one comment on the question that Ethan got, because we actually, when we purchase cobalt, we realized there's a market price for it. So it doesn't mean that if you buy less sustainable cobalt, it comes with a lower price. So there's a market price for us and it costs the same effectively. Okay, switching back now to the second life phase of our vehicle. So we actually always designed, or since the beginning, we designed that our batteries would last for whether 8 years or 100,000 miles. That's the warranty that we gave to our customers when we sold the first vehicles in 2013. And what we actually experience is that they have a much better health status than we had foreseen when we did the testing at the BMW group. So which means that the vehicles that we sold really in the first year are still doing fairly good. And we expected that when the battery is at an 80% battery capacity only, that it's not convenient for EV driving anymore, but we realized that this is still enough capacity to keep the battery in storage grids. For example, our plant in Leipzig, where we actually produced the i3, is powered by wind energy, and the storage features about 700 I3 batteries. And we do also have further contracts. For example, we just signed one in the UK with Grid Power, I think they're called, to also provide them with batteries in the near future. And then, so we're looking now at batteries that are roughly 8 years in the vehicle and then have a lifetime of another 10 to 12 years in this second life phase. So which means that we will only have batteries for recycling in, let's say, 10 to in bigger numbers. And there we already have some joint ventures with Northvolt and with Umicore to work on the recycling. And as I said, those batteries are designed for recycling, which counts for the whole vehicle itself. So the vehicle as well as the battery has a recycling possibility of 96%.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. So I'm going to mix it up a little. I'm actually going to turn it over to Mooney, and she's going to ask some participant questions, and we'll just, because we want to make sure we get to those as well. So Mooney, please kick it off with the participant question, and then we'll go back to my questions.
Great, and thanks to all of our attendees that have asked these great questions. I've got a couple for our esteemed panelists, and let's jump right in. Are there any emissions or hazardous waste produced by the recycling process / extraction of chemicals from lithium batteries? What does that process look like, and is there any material or mineral loss?
So anyone want to, that one's up for grabs.
Well, I think, I think we talked a bit about that. There are emissions from every single process in manufacturing of transforming X into Y anywhere. So that, the answer is yes. Another question might be, what's the environmental performance of a kilowatt hour made from recycled batteries versus from virgin natural resources? Maybe that's like another question one may ask. And I don't know, maybe Hanjiro could answer that better than I could, but kind of the embodied CO2 emissions of manufacturing from natural resources typically lies in the kind of 100 to 200 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour range, with massive underestimates from our experience modeling the chemical manufacturing. So there are estimates in the like 70 to 80 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour range, and I think those are way too low. But I think Hanjiro, you've done some LCN on recycling, right?
Yeah, yes. The answer, you did. I think you nailed it. Yes, the answer is yes. There's emissions in any process. I'm glad we settled on that. I think,
it's not about exterminating them, right? It's about minimizing them. There's always an impact. Right.
There's obviously a range of processes for recovering materials from batteries, and it starts with mechanical processes where the battery is often disassembled or shredded or parts are removed, and it ends with processes which use in more and more intensive levels of heat, so pyrometallurgical processes and chemicals, hydrometallurgical processes, leaching chemicals. So as you use more and more heat, you volatilize things. As you use more and more chemicals, you have wastes. So any process has inputs. There's obviously challenges there. I think Alex's point that the counterfactual is really key here, because what are we displacing with this new process? And just as far as the full footprint of batteries, I do see that there's a large range of estimates for the CO2 intensity of a battery production. I do think that there's estimates that are out there from 65 kilograms per kilowatt hour of a battery all the way up to a couple hundred. In general, though, materials represent, not even half of that generally, particularly in when batteries are manufactured in a more energy intensive, lower throughput. And so, there's a lot of opportunities, as Alex mentioned, to reduce emissions on the assembly side. So just as far as the recycling side, some of those same strategies still apply. So increasing the use of renewable energies as an input into recycling processes of any kind is going to reduce emissions. So like I said, yes, there's opportunities to reduce them. And the important thing is probably the counterfactual.
And I just would want to add, I think what Anjiro and Alex are describing underlies part of the challenge around permitting of these facilities. The extent that we want to see recycling facilities deployed, there's going to be a lot of land use battles and environmental review, permitting, et cetera, to get these facilities sited. But I think we should also keep in mind, to Anjiro's point about counterfactuals, something's going to happen with these batteries, whether it's in the US or not. I mean, right now, for example, if you look at nickel hydride batteries from like Toyota Priuses, a lot of those are just being shipped overseas. They're being deployed in developing countries. Who knows what's happening with them, how they're being disposed of. So I do think we need to think about counterfactuals. We need to take into account the impacts, and we need to think about a plan going forward for how we're going to get all this infrastructure deployed and how we can do that in a sustainable and equitable way, so that we're not just burdening the usual typically low-income communities of color that get the brunt of these industrial facilities sited in their communities. So that's why we need to be thinking about this proactively with a long-term national plan, at least here in the United States, about how to deal with this material.
Great.
Yeah, where's the YIMBY movement, right? Like, I want to build lithium mines in the United States. We should have 3 or 5 or something, right? But which ones, right? Some of them are more problematic than others, right? There should be an Earthworks list of approved projects, like where's that, right?
It's at responsiblemining.net.
Right.
You should
It's
for
responsible
responsible
mining,
mining.
yeah.
Okay, perfect.
But we don't do recycling. I mean, that comes from elsewhere.
Right.
I think Mooney, I was also introduce Mooney as our strategic partnerships director. She's been with Veloz for I think a little over a month, but I just wanted to introduce her properly, and then she's going to ask one more question right now from the participants.
Okay, team, I've got a hard one for you. How will the increased need for battery storage at electric vehicle charging sites affect the supply chain? How is that factored into your projections for demand?
Oh, interesting. Co-located storage. Yeah. Okay.
Like grid storage?
Yeah, I think they're talking about about the demand for grid storage versus the demand for transportation sources in the overall EV, market. I mean, I'm sure other people maybe have thoughts on this. I would just say though that currently there's a lot of capacity. We've been ramping up the build out of capacity for building batteries, right? Globally, they're building supply lines, they're building manufacturing lines of batteries. Most of those lines, those manufacturing lines, aren't at full capacity yet. There's a lot more capacity that could be done out of existing manufacturing facilities. And so I think when I look at batteries and I look at demand, I generally look at manufacturing capacity as a top line, which I think is helpful in that it captures, I think, some of the other markets for batteries, not just EVs. So that would be one way to think about the material demand.
And I think this is tough to kind of forecast the stationary energy storage side, like at EV charging stations, but really, home batteries as well. And there was a question about, home batteries or business type batteries, distributed batteries. But one thing to keep in mind about the stationary storage market is that there's a lot of different technologies that could potentially meet our energy storage needs. And for example, for long duration batteries, we may be looking at vanadium based batteries, not lithium batteries. Lithium batteries tend to be better for sort of short duration storage. And then of course there's pumped hydro, compressed air, there are flywheel storage. So I definitely think we already do see a lot of lithium batteries deployed for stationary energy storage, but there's just to keep in mind that that's a bit of a moving target as well. And it's not clear how big that market for lithium stationary storage would be compared to the transportation demand that we see.
And it's depending on where the question was coming from a global supply chain perspective and mineral sourcing perspective, the forecast that Earthworks did, the Earthworks commissioned, looked at 100% renewable period, and that included battery storage as well as, or stationary storage as well as batteries for EVs. But that was a fairly broad overview. It may not be very helpful if what your question is storage capacity in a particular grid or subsector versus transportation storage in a particular grid or subsector.
Just to jump back onto Ethan's point, there's a range of different opportunities for integrating storage in the grid. There's different values of that, like different economic returns for putting storage in different services. Some of those services can be stacked, meaning it can do more than one thing at a time. Things can be sited to support EV charging, to reduce demand, to reduce load, but it's a relatively small market. And as Ethan acknowledged, there's certain services which we've seen lithium batteries installed into the grid a lot now, but that's a relatively small part of the overall storage market. It's really about the types of services it provides, which is frequency and area regulation within small areas to basically defer in other investments in transmission and distribution. Essentially, the big pie, the big wedge of storage is about these kind of daily and larger arbitrage shifts. So big shifts of bringing power from when the sun shines to when it doesn't. Lithium batteries aren't going to really be a big cut of that market, probably. There's a lot of better technologies like pumping water uphill. I mean, we've all heard of probably that. Pumped hydro. Yeah, pumping water uphill, very effective for storing large amounts of energy over a certain amount of time. Obviously geographically constrained, but just to put that in there. So that the piece I think that we're talking about is it's a tiny wedge to some extent of the overall storage picture.
Great. So one last question from our attendees. Are there any specific technologies within mining, chemical refining, and chemical processing that show particular promise in your mind to decarbonize the supply chain in the midst of oncoming ramp in productions?
I'll just speak in terms of lithium natural resource development. So at a very high level, lithium comes from kind of half and half from mineral resources, mostly in Australia, and brines, mostly in South America. And a brine is a very high salt content water. And basically, like the separation and purification process to make a lithium chemical from either ore, as an engineer, I like to use kind of a folk thermodynamic way of thinking about it. In the mineral process, a large amount of heat needs to be input, and in the brine process, kind of selection operation needs to happen. We published an LCA in January of 2020 showing that the heat required to drive that transformation of the mineral to liberate the lithium carries a huge CO2 impact that was never really quantified or published before. And that is done in China, and it used to be mostly coal fired. So no one actually buys lithium from Australia. No lithium is made in Australia. It is processed in China. And some of the converters that process that mineral are burning 2 tons of coal per ton of lithium hydroxide to do it. So technologies that unlock unconventional brines are very promising because that thermal energy just simply isn't needed. Or a much smaller quantity of thermal energy is needed. I've spent a lot of time working on those types of technologies because I think they're critical for reducing the CO2 intensity of the lithium chemical supply chain.
Okay, anyone else want to? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Mooney, and thanks to our participants for the questions. And I had a bunch of other questions to ask our panelists, but it looks like we're almost out of time with our 1.5 hour webinar. So appreciate everyone's time. And I'm just going to wrap up with a couple things, activities from Veloz, and just then we will go from there. So I'm going to share my screen again. That is the plan. Okay, and just wrap up with a couple things from. So we did the participant Q&A, and thank you everyone. And so just a few things about Veloz. We are excited to launch our 2020 campaign that we're working on right now in early December is the plan. So we really are excited about this new campaign. We hope that you look for it. And once you see the campaign, we want everyone to amplify it as much as possible and get the word out there. So more to come on that, but we're excited about what's coming. Also, we just want you to check out our new tool on the electricforall.org consumer kind of electric car shopping assistant. So the Home Charging Advisor is a new tool we just launched in the last week or two that allows electric car drivers to find home chargers, level 2 home chargers available in their area, and all the incentives that they're eligible for by zip code. And in Q1 of 2021, we will be launching a single application tool. So once you find the charger you're interested in, find your incentives, you can use one application to apply for all the different incentives for your level 2 home charger. So we're excited about that tool. So please visit electricforall.org to view that tool. And then we will be launching our 2021 webinar series very soon. So we hope that you sign up for our eBlast system, our eBlast, so that you can get notifications of our webinar series, our forums, learn about our campaign, and then make sure you follow us on all the social media platforms to continue to follow us and learn more as we roll out more content and more ways to get involved. And the best way to really get involved with Veloz is to become a member. So we hope that you will reach out to us, reach out to Mooney. If you have questions about membership, go to our website to learn more about membership. So with that, I really just want to thank all of our great speakers. The content today was amazing. I learned so much, and I hope that I imagine our participants learned a lot as well. Thank you for your time, and everyone just have a great rest of your day. So thank you.